to show you the tools that are available for you to leverage in order for you to get your job done. So we're going to talk about Azure, but shameless plug. If you don't already know, Anthony and I run a little blog site called canitpro.net. Happy to say that we're now, is it sixth worldwide
TechNet blog.
Of all TechNet's sites worldwide for Microsoft.
But that's 100,000 visitors a month.
100,000
uniques every month.
100,000 unique visitors.
It's even more than that, but keeps growing.
Anyway, it's growing. It's not bad for a little site that only 2 people contribute to. Not just 2 people. We do have MVP Wednesdays where we highlight Canadian talent. So if you want to follow us, if you want to read our, so a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight has been documented step-by-steps, resources on canitpro.net, or if you're on Twitter, #canitpro. So let's start with the main idea. Nearly every enterprise today can benefit from using cloud computing or Windows Azure. Now we have converted. Absolutely. And why? Well, if we look at how change happens in the industry, any industry, there's always the first guy that does something new because it's strategic, because he wants to be the first one to use that innovation in order to further his business. So he's the first one. He comes in, he's got really high competitive advantage because he's the only one that does it. Over time, and suddenly a second firm says, hey, these guys are doing something really cool. And they're making money at it. So why can't we do it? And then they get into the business. And then the next one, well, it's called the third one on the slide, but it may be the X company. It does it because really it's now becoming commodity. It's now becoming the norm. It's the same thing with people like my father who buys touchtone phones now because he can't find a rotary phone anywhere. It's not because he wants to be at the cutting edge, it's because he can't find the stuff he was used to doing it. So if you put that curve onto the categorizing of spending or IT spending versus competitive advantages, the beginning is you're doing it because it's strategic. You're doing it because there's a business reason to highlight your capabilities or your company's capabilities to doing it. Differentiate yourself from all your competitors. I'm doing something better. I'm doing it more efficiently. I can deliver quicker, and so on. But then you end up with the utility users. Same with electricity. Plug in your hairdryer in the morning. Well, maybe not. Sorry. You plug in your hairdryer in the morning, you just want it to work. You don't care where the electricity comes from. You do in a data center. You just want it to work. It becomes utility. Cloud computing is going that way, where you need to run some workloads. You won't really care what hardware it's running on, what virtualization platform it's running. You don't care. You just want to be able to spin a service and use it. And when you're done with it, shut it down, and then you're not paying for it anymore. That's what cloud computing is going to. That's the trend. We're not quite there into utility yet, but it's definitely the way the curve is going towards. So, and why do leaders care about it? Well, the ones that care about the strategic application, they care because they want to support new ways of doing things, modern application, new business ideas that haven't been developed for the old way of doing things, the mobility side of things, the phone, tablets, mobile, back end to support all of that. That didn't happen. That didn't exist before, so you couldn't take advantage. You couldn't support those new modern applications on it. Elastic resources. We're all in business to make money, for the most part. Some of us do it, well, maybe not me. Some of us do it because of philanthropy and they want to make the world a better place, and thank God for those people. The rest of us do it to make money, so what we want to make sure is that we use our resources effectively. Cloud computing allows you to do that. If you're a small company and you start with a small service and suddenly it takes off, it's when people are realizing that the service that you have is good and they're flocking to it. But since you're a small company, the hardware that you need, or the infrastructure you need to put in place, and you know probably better than anybody else in this room, how much of a pain it is and how expensive it is to actually lay the groundwork up front for those events, for those customers to come and use it. If you're small and you grow really, really fast, it becomes a strain on your own resources to keep up with the demand, keep up with getting your infrastructure to keep up with the demand. So elastic resources, very important. And of course, support for very fast development. The people that look at the utility side of things is they look at it for two things: low cost, reliability. I don't want to pay more than I had to when I had that rotary phone. Okay, well, I'll give you the touch-tone phone for free. That works. Reliability, when I pick it up and dial, do I still get a phone call at the other end? Yes. Perfect. That's what they care about. These are the people that are on the utility side of the curve. And cloud, it provides both. In different ways, but it does provide both. So why Microsoft Azure? Speed. So you guys tell me, because this is supposed to be an ask us anything. So let's start the conversation. It goes both ways. How long does it take you to deploy, to provision, acquire, provision, and make a server available for somebody else in your office, for a developer or something, to actually use it? A server from scratch.
Because they acquire days.
Days. Typically it's days. I've talked to some people in the public sector, and with the appropriation and the authorization and the signature from this person and the signature from this person and the PO for the third person, it comes into months. In Azure, somebody shows up, and we're all in IT, so also when we get the guy from the dev team that comes over to the table and says, I'm building an app for business unit X, so I'm ready to test. So I need 3 front-end running IIS, I need a worker role on the back for the processing, and a SQL backend. And if we could get it by tomorrow, that'd be wonderful. In the old world, it's like, you have to remind me, I don't even know where the servers are. You gotta take it, rack them, install them, patch them, connect them. A SharePoint farm, for example. Take a week at least, to put a full SharePoint farm end-to-end configured and ready to be used by the developer for testing an application. In Azure, you can get a SharePoint farm running in about an hour and a half. Speed. 12 minutes to spin up a server. 2012 R2. From the minute you decide I need it to the minute it's ready for you to log on to it, 12 minutes average. Scale. There are different ways of doing scale. You can scale up, you can scale out. Scale up is to add more resources to the host that you already have. More cores, more memory, more network bandwidth. That's, in a physical world, really hard to do. You know, shut down the server, take the cover off, plant some more memory in it, or replace the CPU, or at the very least replace the motherboard if it doesn't support. There's lots of ways that it can go wrong. In the virtual world, you look at the configuration of your machine and you say, from a A1 of 2 CPUs and 1.75 gigs of RAM to a G5 at, what's a G5 now, 60 CPUs, 500 gigabytes of RAM. And all you need to do is pick it, save, and apply. Machine resets, boom, it's got all those resources. Then we go back to the elastic capacity I was talking about earlier. You use it for a day, because those G5s are very expensive. Use it for a day for when you need that power to do media coding and coding or something. But when you don't need it anymore, you shut it down. You're not paying for it anymore. If you had to source that amount of power within your own data center, it would cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you would only get a portion of that back because it would be sitting idle most of the time. So scale, big thing. Economics, well, it's a no-brainer. I don't know if anybody here has ever looked, you have, at the price of storage per terabyte per month, so that you know how much you're going to charge your customers, you know how much you need to budget for. Well, a terabyte of storage in Azure in the geo-replicated way, which means there's 3 copies in one data center, and there's 3 copies in another data center in another region. So worlds apart, different fault tolerance. If the data center is in California, there's an earthquake and it slips into the Pacific, the data's fine. It's geo-replicated. So 6 different copies of your data across multiple data centers. 1 terabyte with about 500,000 transactions on that data during a month will run you about, say, 80 to 90 bucks, depending on the amount of egress or network usage you do to access it. Forrester estimates that SAN storage is at least 4 times more expensive than cloud storage. So economics speaks for itself.
But actually, the beauty of what you were offering, so people fail to realize in SAN storage, is when you buy SAN, you buy 300 terabytes, 400 terabytes, and you start at 0. And the clock is ticking as soon as you install it. So you take out 1, 2, 3, over time. So there's a huge array of massive storage you'll never use over time. And by the time you get to 2.5 years, you're thinking, your sales rep is telling you, I better refresh it. I better start planning and buy another one in parallel so you can do the migration. So cloud storage makes 100% sense.
Yes, and let me pull out my whiteboard. So if we have terabytes, terabytes over time.
Terabytes over time.
The typical curve is this. That means that at any given point, this is where you sit. So you're sitting here, because I think the average growth year over year is anywhere between 40 and 60%. So the growth of your data, the stuff that you need to keep, the stuff that you need to back up, to keep active, grows year over year, 40 to 60%, depending on different factors. When you're sitting here, the majority of that data is probably files that you've not used in years, that you don't even know you have anymore. But you need to keep it, because we're the IT folks. We're not the business people. We're not the people that look at the report from the board of directors report from 2010 and say, is this relevant? Can I trash it? Is it a corporate record? Is it something that by law I need to keep? We don't know. We're the custodian of the data. We're not the owner of the data. Which typically at the end of the month is when we send the emails to the business units and say, guys, it's time to clean up. Please go through your project folders and delete anything that's not needed. And you come back the week after and you realize that there's more stuff in there than there was the week before. Because now you've reminded them that they have data on their local machine that should really be in the group directory. So it never really comes back down. So that's where we're sitting. Where your active data is, it's probably more like this. That's your active data. That's the stuff that's being used every week, every day. This is stuff that all the employees are working on right now. So realistically, in the perfect world, this should be on-premise, and this should be in the cloud. Because the bulk of your data is going to cost you 4 times as less to store than it would if you were to add it on-premise. So look at appliances that do tiered storage. So they will do the hot, warm, and cold data. Hot data on an SSD set of spindles, very fast, very high IOPS, good performance. Warm data goes down to the HDDs, which don't spin as fast, and the I/O is a little lower, but you don't need it as often. And then the cold data, have your appliance encrypt it and ship it to the cloud. When the user opens a file share, and they see a file, they don't care where it is. They don't even know where it is. If they pick a file that's in the cloud, the appliance will just go get it, present it to them, maybe a little bit longer for the file to download. Then the person uses the file, changes the file, now it becomes hot again. Now it's back into your active set because it's being used. Now it gets saved locally until it ages to the point where it goes back up to the cloud. It's a very efficient way to use the resources you have and the resources that you could have. I am not saying that what you should do is go back to your office and take every sand closet that you have and throw them out. It's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is, when you get to the point where you're almost at capacity, you get to the point where you have to start thinking about, I need to buy another closet, another rack of discs. At that point, ask yourself, is there something I could do using cloud technology to let my needs grow without having for me to add more capital expenditures and racks into my data center? Because it's not just the rack, it's not just the disk, it's the management of it, it's the cooling of it, it's the electricity from it, it's the footprint of it. Like if you put a data center, let's say in downtown Vancouver or downtown Toronto, the square footage is horrendous. Now, you put a rack of discs there, well, that's another 4 square feet at least. If you're not counting the backspace that
You
it
measure
needs.
it 20 square foot per rack.
Is that what you measure it at?
And most buildings downtown won't take the load of one rack for this. It's all down stories.
Well, that's because, yeah, because it exceeds the pounds per square foot of the cement slab. So these are all things you need to think about. So you have to put a whole bunch of half racks, but now you have more square footage, so they make more money. Maybe that's just an excuse.
Storage vendors make out.
Exactly. So when we look at why Azure, these are the reasons. Now there are, and these slides are there so we can start generating the discussion. At any point you have a question, you have, ask us anything.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Feel free to ask.
Peter, walk us through a scenario, let's say you want to put a server or a desktop on the Azure. How do you go about it?
Well, Azure is not, or cloud computing itself is not the, desktop is not the right way, because you don't want to, let's say you're doing VDI, virtual desktop infrastructure. It's a lot of resources for a desktop. There's probably better ways of doing that. But let's say server, let's say you have an application. If you have an application on your on-premise, so this is your on-premise, you have to worry about the networking, the storage of server, the virtualization of the OS, middleware, the runtime, the data, and the application itself. And there's one more that's not on the list. That is typically the bane of our existence if we're in IT. The users. If you go to infrastructure as a service, which is what this is, the closest thing you have to what you have on your own data center, which is basically the way to extend your data center. So if we look at a data center, so let's say I got my home office in which I have a virtual network with a front end, a back end network, then a gateway to Azure, where you have a network with your front end gateway, your front end, your back end, and the gateway, and it connects with a site-to-site VPN. Now you've just extended your own data center to Azure. To anything you have here in terms of management capabilities, server manager, system center, whether or not you're doing your management by a sneaker net, by a collection of VB scripts that you've been collecting for the past 15 years, or a system center, or anything like that, Puppet Chef, you name it. Now this appears to the rest of your network as it's part of your network, because it is. It's a routed network, the same as another branch office, for example. So you have an application running on-premises. I always mix those two. You have an application that's running on premises, and you want to move it here. Well, as long as it's in the VHD format, so if it's in VMware, there are tools to convert VMware to VHDs. If it's a physical, there are tools to convert physical to VHDs. Once it's in the VHD, then you can just upload that VHD into Azure. So your front end, so your web server that's here, and a SQL server that's running in your data center. So you've got that little application that has a SQL backend, convert them to 2 VHDs, copy them here, create virtual machines based on those VHDs. The only thing that'll change is its IP address. Spin them back up, create an endpoint, and an endpoint in Azure is just a way to go through the load balancer. So the load balancer sits on top of Azure and it controls the traffic to and from internet. And it will say port 80 on the outside is port 80 on the inside for my web server. Nobody needs to have access to my SQL box from the outside because only the web server needs to talk to it. And you're done. Your application is migrated to the cloud. Step one. Pretty easy. The only thing you may have to change is the connection string of your web app so that it can find where your SQL server now is. That's it. But that will also give you, if we look at, let's say, my virtual network, I actually took that very specific scenario and looked at it where I created in the central region a virtual network, and I created in the east region another virtual network. Those two virtual networks, if I look at the dashboard, are connected with this site-to-site VPN. So my network in the east is connected to my network in the central, just as two branch office or two floors of the same building. It's just a routed network. In that network, I have one SQL server and two web servers running in the east, and two web servers running in central. Those in each city, so let's say the first one, the endpoints, and the endpoints is, well, like I said, is the connection that goes through the load balancer. So it's almost like a port mapping, internet to internal. My endpoints are load balanced set, which means to a term called web farm. So anything that listens on port 80 outside, public, private port inside. So my web frontend 01 listens to 80, and my web frontend 02 also listens to 80. But what it does is it load balanced. So if I get suddenly lots of load, I just spin up another instance of my application. And I spread the load balance in one site. On top of that, so I've got this in the east, I've got the exact same thing in central. Now in the load balancer, I go and I say, okay, I've got those two sites, so I'll tell my traffic manager to monitor the endpoints in the east and the endpoints in the west. And it just says degraded here because this is a test environment. The web servers that I have very, very little power, just enough to run. So it's telling me that I should really just up the bandwidth and up the power of these servers. It's not, but what it does is, if I go to my dashboard and I see that address, which in a DNS environment could very well be redirected, and I connect to it, and it's going to be a little slow because those machines are, okay. Now, we're in Vancouver. The load balancer, because I configured it for performance use, you configure it for performance, for failover, or for hot site redundancy. So it knows I'm in Vancouver, so the closest data center to me is the central. The only thing I changed in all of those web servers is the icon. I put central 1, central 2, and east 1 and east 2. So if I'm in Montreal, I do the exact same test. I'm going to get east 1 or east 2. And if I refresh this box, now it's central 1. Let me refresh it again. Now it's central 2. Because it's load balance. I've got two sites, load balance between the servers within each site, and both of those sites are load balanced for performance across the internet, so that my customers will always connect to the best experience possible, the lowest latency possible by connecting to the closest where that resource is. So in about 5 minutes, we've looked at taking an application from on-premise, and it would take longer than that in real life, but converting it to a VHE, uploading it to Azure, into a data center, or a virtual network that you've created, and exposing it to the internet. I actually ran a camp for some of our APG accounts today, and the lab number 1 was to actually create this, but in a single location. And the lab takes about 1 hour and 15 minutes for people that have never had their hands on Azure to create their cloud service, their virtual network, their storage account, upload the data, create not even upload their own PHP, spin a new virtual machine for IIS, spin a new SQL server, load the data into SQL Server, and deploy the application in 1 hour to 1 hour and 15 minutes. Remember earlier I was talking about speed of deployment? That is speed of deployment.
So what you're doing is you're relaxing, say, 1 while you're operating on 2, so when it's working faster, and this is more relaxed, so when you jump back and get the higher performance.
For jumping between 1 and 2 here, you mean? No, this one's actually doing a round robin.
Yeah.
So the first connection goes to 1, second connection goes to 2, third connection goes to 1, fourth connection goes to 2. So it just keeps directing traffic 1 at a time.
Mm-hmm.
There are appliances or virtual appliances that you can put in Azure that'll do more granular load balancing. And that's part of our ecosystem. That's part of the Azure ecosystem. We've got tons of partners that are creating those virtual appliances to be put to take advantage, like firewalls to put in Azure. Most people kind of think about it and say, well, firewall, a virtual firewall, well, how good is that? It still takes every packet coming in, does a deep inspection of where it came from, where it's going, what's the payload, do I want to allow it, and do I want to redirect it, and then let it go. Whether it's a virtual appliance or a real appliance, it still has the same meaning. The rules of good IT governance do not change when you go from on-premises to the cloud. You still have to do due diligence. You still have to cover your behinds. You still have to edge your bets in terms of, if I'm going to put a web server in the cloud, and that web server is not access to some sensitive data, I've got to make sure that I'm protecting it. Because we've just opened port 80. Now it's open. The load balancer that sits on top of Azure does some denial of service mitigation, so not identity, but intrusion detection, some basic firewall functions. But if you choose to open a port to a virtual machine that is sitting in an environment like this, where once somebody comes into that machine, they basically have a pipe into your own environment, you've got to secure it. This is high level, but there are ways to set ACLs to that virtual network so that only, let's say that your front-end server is allowed to talk to your back-end. The only thing that's allowed to talk to the back to across the VPN is those 2 machines. But you can lock it down as much as you want or as little as you want. But it's your responsibility. So if we go back to here, to our model, if we're an IaaS, infrastructure as a service, which is the example I just gave, we look after the networking, so you don't have to pull cables, you don't have to rack switches. We look at the storage, we look after the underlying servers, the metal, then the virtualization stack, which in our case is Hyper-V. You take care of the OS, middleware, runtime data, and application that's inside that VM. There's a myth in the marketplace that if you spin a virtual machine in the cloud, you don't have to punch it. I've had that question many times. I'm putting a virtual machine in the private cloud. I'm being told that you're doing the management for me, I don't have to patch it. You're wrong. Everything in infrastructure as a service, and that's the same for us, it's the same for Amazon Web Services, it's the same for Google. If you're putting a VM into the cloud, whatever is inside that VM is your responsibility. We're not gonna manage it for you inside the VM. If you do platform as a service, so Azure SQL, Azure websites, which you can do the exact same thing, but you need to modify your application. You may have to customize the application a little bit. You have to move the data into SQL. This, you only have to worry about the application itself and the data. We take care of everything underneath it. However, you don't have control as to when we patch it. We patch it on Patch Tuesday, period. So you can't say, can you wait a week while I'm testing the app? No, on Patch Tuesday, that patch will be deployed. You don't have visibility into that. However, if we're in website, for example, Azure websites, so I look at a website that I have here, and let's go to the scale. Because that's all that layer underneath has been abstracted and we take care of it, it opens up huge scaling opportunities. Of course, we have the scaling up, which I talked about earlier. So I can go from a small instance to a medium instance to a large instance, but that's not an efficient way of increasing your capacity. So if we look, and before I get there, let's look at the cloud services that are good candidates for cloud computing, and then we'll go back to that scaling example. On and off. A real world example, one of my old customers, actually I talked to them a couple weeks ago, Elections Canada. When the elections gets called at the end of the year, they're going to have 4 days by law to deploy 312 offices across the country and be ready with machines, databases, a full list of registered voters so that anybody can walk into the office and check their registration or register themselves, because I come from Quebec and now I'm in BC. They have 4 days. Now it runs for about a month for the campaign, and then there's the event, the election, and then they clean up after the next couple of weeks. Now, if it was majority government, they can turn off those servers for up to 4 years. They still have to store them, they still have to maintain them, they still have to own them. So they gotta have spare parts. Actions Canada has pallets of 56K modems. I'm not kidding, because when they bought those servers, the RFP that they bought the servers for, that was a requirement. So they said, well, if one breaks, we'll need to replace it. So they bought extra 56K modems, because that's the backup to if you're in Iqaluit and the internet goes down, you want to be able to connect to a phone line. But now they're storing them in a warehouse somewhere, so they're paying for it. It's not being used, but they're paying for it. On and off. Azure, shut it down and deallocate it, so you release the resources from it. You're not paying for it anymore.
Well, we're phasing out the 56K modem.
Yeah, that was just an example. It's
Yeah.
But the server itself, the computing capacity, they've paid for it, and they're paying for it every year because they amortize it over 4 or 5 years. So they're always paying for those machines that are sitting in the warehouse. Growing fast. You're a small company, we talked about this earlier. Yeah, your company takes off, everything's fine, and all of a sudden people realize that you have a good service, people come to you, and you start pulling money into the infrastructure to support that growth. You don't have to. Azure will take care of that for you. This is a good one. Unpredictable bursting. So you've been in business for a year or so, you've got a nice growth curve, and all of a sudden it kind of like, now you're running well, you're running at about 80% capacity. You don't have to invest too much into your infrastructure. Everything's going good. They're going according to plan. Now this is Vancouver. There's lots of celebrities walking around. One celebrity notices your service and tweets about it. Then the next day, boom, you triple or quadruple your demand. Does your infrastructure support it? Will it? Or are you going to get the spinning donut of death, or the 404 error, or whatever other error the web server can spit out? Because you didn't plan for this, you didn't have the capacity for this. Azure will do this for you. Azure will scale up. scale out, sorry, and scale back down when it's gone.
Is it manual or is it automatically detect?
Both, I'll show you in a second. That's why I wanted to go through this slide before I go to the example, or the real world example. The other one is predictable bursting. This is Cyber Monday. This is Christmas holidays. The next one would be Valentine's Day, when every man realizes he forgot to buy his wife a present and goes online 3 days before and hopes to God they can get it delivered on time. Companies know that, and they plan for it. It's called predictable bursting. Actually, this model here, this pattern of computing, is the mother of cloud computing. This is how it all started. There's this really big online retailer out there that had the plan for the peaks during the year, but operated in the valleys most of the year. And somebody had the brilliant idea to say, how can we monetize this? Hey, let's start renting compute power. Boom. That's how cloud computing was invented. That's how public cloud was invented. And we all know which company I'm talking about, right? Amazon. So, yes, they were the first ones to come up with that. Now, let's go back to our example here. So now, set up a schedule. So I can set up a schedule from that time to that time in that time zone. You want to differentiate between day and night. You want to differentiate between weekdays and weekends. You set a schedule. On that schedule, you set an amount of instances that you want to have spun up. So before Cyber Monday, you want to max out your amount of instances because you know you're going to get hammered. And before Christmas, same thing. But in between, you want to release them. So you set a schedule to take advantage of the predictable bursting. Or you go by CPU. And out of the portal gives you a pretty, it's a good way of scaling, but it's not as granular as some people might want it. You may want to be able to do by number of connection per servers, by memory usage on that server. Maybe you've got the exact same number of people on each server, but one's using a lot of memory power versus CPU. So this is just the entry point. If you tag on to this Microsoft System Center Operations Manager with Orchestrator, for example, you can automate a lot more of the scaling in and out, still dynamic, but more granular. But right out of the box, I say, okay, CPU. I want to set CPU. I want to start with at least 2 instances for make sure that if one fails, that the other one actually stays there. And I'm going to go up to 8 instances as long as my CPU power stays between 50 and 80. If it's lower than 50, I'm paying for more resources than I need, so I'm not being efficient. If it's above 80, whatever I have is working too hard, and most likely I am not satisfying my customers because they maybe the page doesn't refresh as fast, maybe they have the speed of the refreshing, loading. What's the other one that we always see? Buffering. These are the things you see.
Spooling.
Spooling. So you want to make sure that your CPU is in that sweet spot. That sweet spot is where you're being efficient with the resources, but not paying too much for them. Now, it's on CPU. Do we want to do this real time? Who's the last person who has looked at the task manager in their CPU graph?
I always look, if I try to lower the thing every time.
Yeah, but if you're looking at the spikes, every 2-3 minutes it'll spike up.
Over CPU.
So you'll be over CPU. So if you're doing it real time, every 3 minutes you're spinning an instance, but a minute later you're taking it down. Not efficient. So the way it does it is an aggregate average over a period of time. That is, I think it's about an hour. I'm not 100% sure, but it's about an hour. So your aggregate average over your 2 instances is above your sweet spot. I'm going to put in a third machine. And it keeps track of the average. Oh, the average is still above 80%, I'm gonna put a fourth machine. And it does that until it matches your maximum number of machines. Because that's as much as you're willing to pay. Or as much as you can afford, that's not for discussion here. Then all of a sudden the rush is over. Now your CPU aggregate, your aggregate average drops below you. So now we're paying for too many resources that we're not using. So you'll start shedding instances until it reaches your minimum, as long as it stays in that sweet spot. So that's what we call unpredictable bursting. It takes care of it. Now I got a question today about specifically that. It's like, well, if you can take care of it on the by using your metrics, why would you bother with the schedule? This is reactive. It'll take about an hour for the average to grow over 80%. So during that hour, you may miss some transaction because people are going to go to another site. It's not being responsive enough. By setting it in the schedule, it's because you know that load is going to happen. But it doesn't mean that you can't set a schedule and burst on top of it. So like I said earlier, we're not in the business of telling you how to do your job, but we're in the business of giving you tools so that you can adapt those tools to service your business needs.
Is it possible to give you some kind of best practices for warning, or this is the best optimized of your usage or something?
We don't do well, we do some monitoring. So let me discard my changes here and go to the top and to the monitor tab. So we do monitor a whole bunch of metrics, and you can add more add metrics. So it's pretty much anything that you can count in terms of I/O, memory usage, disk page writes, reads, and so on. You can monitor, and then you can set alarms based on those. Not as granular, not as comprehensive as, let's say, operations manager, but it's a good start. If you have an operations manager, put the Azure pack on it, and you start monitoring your own websites and your own machines in Azure with the equipment, with the management and monitoring platform you already have. And from there, then you can create your own alerts that will say, I see here that most of the time we're at that, so maybe we should change our baseline to match what's there. So, no, we're not going to tell you having 4 instances is more efficient, but we'll give you the data for you to make that own decision. That makes sense? Any other questions? Yes?
What if you're in the streaming media business and one of the limits is like your bandwidth?
Okay.
How would we scale according to that one? It's just basically starting to account for more for the bandwidth that we use, or?
In Azure, we sell you 3 things, and 3 things only. Every service in Azure is based, the pricing is based on those 3 things. What are they?
Amount of resources that use, the space available.
So compute, storage, and network access. We only charge you for egress, not ingress. So whatever you put into Azure, we're not charging you for it. Whatever you take out of Azure, whatever you're streaming from Azure, then you're paying for it. In terms of scaling and whether or not we can use that, okay, if you use a lot, then you're going to pay a little bit more. Right. What are the 2 most streamed events in the last, actually, I think it's history. The most 2 streamed events in history. Like for Canada, let's put it this way.
Royal wedding?
Nope.
Olympics.
Olympics, Canada, US medal game last year. And the last one, Super Bowl, 3 weeks, a month ago. I think the Super Bowl, I think it was 1.5 or something like that million concurrent streams at the peak. It barely hit 10% of capacity, and both those events were on Azure. NBC uses Azure for all of their media streaming because they leverage not only the website part of it, but they also leverage the content delivery networks. There's over 60 different services that are built on the infrastructure. content delivery network is one, like a CDN, where you put in the content and it's basically spreads it worldwide and can be accessed worldwide. Again, depending on where you deploy it. If you don't want to put it in Australia, you don't have to put it in Australia. Well, these are the capacities. So if you're into streaming media, absolutely. The other end of that equation, if you want to encode the data, if you want to generate the data, we support, let's say, batch processing. Look up TechEd Europe in October. The first keynote, Mark Rozinovich did a demo of batch processing on Azure, where he had a fairly honking machine under the stage doing rendering of a very complicated, very detailed image. And he started it, and you can see like, it's barely working. Now he took that exact same image and the plugins for the rendering engine to send it to Azure batch processing, where the plugin takes that image, cuts it into squares, into a grid, and each server, and assigns different servers in Azure, and each server gets to render one of that square, and then there's the last server, so if there's 36 squares, for example, there's going to be 37 servers. The 37th collects the squares from everybody and stitches them together. Well, he started the first one, did his spiel, talked about it, then went and started the second one on Azure. And before he was done talking about it, it was rendered, and he went back to the first one. He went back to the first one, which is the deck because I'm not plugged in, so it's. Before he went back to the first one, and the second square had not finished rendering. So it's not only about providing the data or streaming the data or the media, it's also how to encode it, how to render it, and that's why you're in that business. That's why Hollywood is looking at cloud computing, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud, in order to take advantage of those elastic resources. You're not going to need those resources every day, 9 to 5, to render data, but you do all the little things that need to be done, and all of a sudden you've got this thing that needs to be rendered into a 10-minute movie, and then you send it. Now you require tons and tons and tons of CPU and memory, and then when it's over, if you have it in your own shop, you're still paying for it. Now you just rented that capacity. When you stop, you're done. I have a machine here that I keep turned off most of the time. It's a DS14 premium machine. It has it's still loading. It's got 16 disks, 16 1 terabyte premium storage disks attached to it. So I can get about 50,000 IOPS on that storage. It has, I think, it's 32 CPUs and 500 gigs of RAM. If you were going to build that server in your data center, I don't even have a clue how much it would be. It would be over $100,000 most likely.
With all that RAM.
But if I need it for a month, it would cost me $8,000. No, actually, that one's $2,000. A G5, which I'm not running because I'm scared to forget to turn it off, is $8,000 a month. But that's hundreds of cores and almost a terabyte worth of RAM. You don't need it in your shop, but you need access to it when you need it. That's what cloud computing is, elastic capacity. I've had that discussion with my dad. My dad is a 75-year-old, and he hates technology. I told you earlier, he buys his touch phone because he can't find a rotary phone. And up to last year, they didn't have a cell phone. I had to buy a cell phone, put money on it, and hide it and give it to my mom. My dad doesn't know they have it. Because I don't do that. If I don't want to be contacted, then you can't contact me. Well, you're 75. Hey?
What if he falls?
Exactly. If you've fallen and you can't get up, that's your phone. He was asking me, because he wonders what I do for a living. And I was telling him about cloud computing, he's like, cloud what? And the only way I could get him to understand what cloud computing is elastic capacity. You need more, you take more. You don't need any more, it shrinks back. You only pay for what you use. That's all cloud computing is. It's elastic capacity. It's the potential for elastic capacity. That's the smallest, most condensed way that I can explain cloud computing. Because you hear about the public cloud, and you hear about private cloud, and you hear about hybrid cloud. It's all the same thing. It's all managing your resources. It's all about allowing you to grow and shrink what you're using and in the manner that's most efficient. That makes sense? Anybody else got questions? All right, let's go back just so we can drive a bit more of the conversation to the slide that's one everybody wants to see. And this is old. We are now up to 19 regions worldwide with over 80 data center. The Australian, Japan, and LATAM, so the Brazil data centers, on the slide says announced, but they're actually online now, so they should be blue like the other ones. In the US, there's now a US 2, and there are more regions, but just to kind of give you an idea of what we cover. This does not impress me. Well, it does, but it's not what impresses me the most. This is what impresses me the most. We double our compute and storage every 6 months.
Is that within the existing locations or additional locations? Is that within the existing locations, the government, or is it?
There's no way to do this within the existing location. So we just keep adding data centers and adding regions to support that load. Case in point, I heard one of the customers in one of our US data centers wanted to increase the number of cores. By subscription, you get a limit in the number of cores you can run. It's like a credit card limit. It's not a set limit. It's this is what we think you can afford to pay right now. But if you say, yeah, but I don't want 100 cores, I want 400 cores. You just call Azure. If it's the small increment, you get it. If it's a very large increment, well, maybe somebody's going to make maybe a little background check or maybe a credit check to make sure that you can afford the bill at the end of the month, and then they increase your limit. That's not the point. But he wanted a very large increase, and we had to tell him no, because the data center that he had selected, because when you create your cloud service, when you create your storage account, when you create your compute nodes, you actually pick where you're going to put them. The data center that he had selected is near capacity. So we said, no, we can't give you that many in that data center. There's another data center that's going to be online anytime soon. So we can give you some now, and then once the other data center, we can move your data to and then give you what you need here. So everybody's happy, but it's not the answer he was looking for right out of the bat. So this is our map, double our capacity. We just, about a month ago, we reached a very unique milestone. We can now sell, we have the capacity to sell 1 exabyte of data. How many zeros is that?
More than a trillion, 3 more than that.
That's 18 zeros after the 1. 18 zeros. Which means, because in Azure, everything is redundant. So that means we have at least 3 exabytes of current capacity to be able to sell 1 exabyte of storage. It's pretty significant. We just passed that line. Yes.
Yes, sir. Can you forecast in the immediate future, for a year, that there will be enough hardware?
Enough hardware? No. First of all, the hardware is getting smaller and more powerful. So
It has to be replaced.
yeah, that's ongoing. That's a continuing wheel. The same as the Fred.
Yeah, I mean, look at CPUs, 18 core CPUs.
Yeah. So, but the same as what you were saying with your SANs is you don't wait for the machines to be out of commission before you bring the next one up next to it, and then you do parallel, and then you slowly take the old stuff out. That's happening in data centers now.
Well, based on a certain architecture for this computing power, right? My next question is, how do are we gonna change standards, computing power? Like, first year is based on what we have today.
Yeah, but it's always evolving. It's always evolving. We've added 300 more features, if you will,
Yes.
capacity in the last 12 months. So 300 new features introduced, tested, put in a preview, and then in general availability in the last 12 months. If you're looking at boxed software, how many improvements can you make to a boxed software in 1 year? Pretty much none, because you want to spread your boxed software to 18 months or 2 years, because you want to recoup some of that investment. In Azure, it's continuous. It just changes all the time. And sometimes it drives me nuts, because I deliver content, I build workshops on the content, I build my images, I print my user manual so that they can follow the lab, and then we get there and they've changed it. I dare them changing it without checking with me first. So yes, it changes all the time. So whatever is new in terms of functionality, framework, open API, stuff like that, we adapt. Good example of that, Docker. Anybody here is in open source? Deals with open source? You do. Docker is something that's coming up in open source. It's been coming up for a while. It's kind of hitting its stride now. It's basically based on Linux or Unix environments where your application become container. It's in a container. And if your environment supports Docker, somebody could take an Azure Docker container with an application in it and basically drop it into any application or any environment that supports Docker, and the APIs will all match. The same thing that, and if you look at their logo, it's literally a shipping container on top of a whale. You can take the shipping container, put it on a boat. You get to their end, you take the shipping container, you put it on a train. You take it from a train, you put it on a truck. It always works, it always fits. That's what Docker is. Docker is very new. It's probably about a year old. About a year old now. It's already supported in Azure. We never even heard of it past a year ago. Well, first of all, that brings a whole new conversation in terms of open source and Microsoft, but we can talk about it in a minute. So yes, things are changing. Infrastructure is changing. APIs, frameworks, everything, it's all changing, and we're changing with it. Not just us, that's all cloud computing.
You see Azure taking over completely.
Taking over what?
The way we deal with computers and processing. I mean, like it's Azure, it's growing.
No. There will always be a need for some on-premise computing. Whether or not that is going to shrink significantly, it depends.
Oh, you see.
You look at healthcare, you look at things that are more sensitive, maybe not. You look at business, financial, absolutely. Just depends on which vertical you are, depends what kind of information you have. There's so many other variables in that question that I say no, it's never going to completely take over. Well, probably not in my lifetime anyway. There's always going to be a need for some local processing.
See, let me try to explain myself. See, the way it is, I believe it, all right? But see, it's, to me right now, it's mind-boggling because, okay, there will be an open source.
No, that's wrong. That's absolutely wrong.
I don't know if we can think about Apple. Sorry. Right? We're talking about Azure, right? Microsoft.
We're talking about cloud computing. More specifically Azure, but cloud computing in general.
I mean, I think we're getting off subject, I'm sorry.
No, but you said that we're going to lose open source. Let me spin it another way. I'm going to give you a statement And you, by raising your hand, tell me whether or not you agree with my statement. Open source is an integral part of the Azure business. You leave it up to Kevin. So I'd say about a little bit more than a third of the room. Almost a half. So the ones that did not raise their hands, why not?
Myself, I'm just new here. I know these two gentlemen at the table. Things the way they're springing up, I'm surprised you can actually keep up with all the information that's coming out.
It's not easy. That's definitely, we're getting more and more less generalist and more specialist because we don't have the capacity to look at everything.
Do you let all the computers do work to stay on top of what's coming at you?
I try as much as I can to automate everything I can. There's a site in Canada that's run by an MVP in Canada that's called the Lazy Admin. That was me.
Oh, yeah.
If I have to do something once, I will do it manually. If I have to do it 500 times, you bet your ass I'm going to automate it so I don't have to do it.
Do you have that favorite toy yet?
Yes, it's sitting right here.
Oh, yeah.
This is my favorite toy. But anyway, so we go back
I was
to.
thinking something more physical with a car or boat or something.
No, I don't have time for toys. Actually, I have a Jeep.
Plane.
Take the doors off, take the roof off.
Is being a millionaire there yet?
I'm not doing this for money.
Oh,
I'll tell you that. I made a lot more money when I was a consultant than I'm doing now. But I'm enjoying myself a lot more now.
yeah, you would have figured that maybe the way it's going, that you had a lot of money. Please.
You don't have to have a lot of money to enjoy yourself.
But this is really important too. You know, the brain is very wonderful. I'm totally blown away by what's going on myself.
It's hard to keep up with. So if we look at open source, because I really don't talk about that. A lot of people in the past have told me they still remember the infamous Ballmer speech. You remember that one?
No.
Ballmer stood in front of a room with thousands of people in it and said, and I quote, "Open source is a cancer." Now that started the downfall of open source versus Microsoft. They're the enemy we need to fight. Ballmer's gone. Satya Nadella's in. What's the most significant or most visible example of our change of mentality within Microsoft in terms of open source, or in terms of any competitors?
All platform welcome.
All platform welcome, but the most significant example of that.
Themselves on the iPad.
Office on the iPad, exactly. How long did it take between Satya coming in and the product being released? 3 months, 4 months.
They had to have been working on it before.
We had it on the shelves months before that, if not years prior to.
There's no.
But
way
the
to develop
mentality of the
it.
management at that time was, let's see if I can, that's my own interpretation, by the way, it's not the Microsoft gospel. My interpretation of it is, somebody says, let's not release Office for the iPad, that way we might be able to slow them down and we can catch up. And we all know how well that worked. So Satya comes in and says, no, our software on every platform, everywhere. We are a software company. Let's make software that runs everywhere. Boom, 3 months later, Office for iPhone, for iPads, and now Outlook on Android, and Outlook on iOS devices. It's our software running everywhere. So we do embrace open source. I don't have specific specs, but I'm being told it's close to a third of all workloads in Azure is running open source.
Wow.
If I go to my compute, to a virtual machine, and I look at the gallery, we have the usual suspects. Have Microsoft images that are provided by the Microsoft product group, so Server, SharePoint, SQL, Vista, Visual Studio, Dynamics, you name it. Oh, we have VanTUG, CoreOS, CentOS, SUSE, Oracle, Linux. Oh, Puppet. Puppet and Chef are the equivalent to SCCM and SCOM for the open source world. It's management and automation for open source Linux environments, Unix Linux environments. It's right there, right in our gallery. That's just for the images that are provided by the organization that managed the kernel for those distributions. What about, close that, go to my virtual machine, I go to images, and I say, look, show me the VM depot. VM depot are images that are not provided by the organization that own them, but by the community, the open source community. So if somebody has a great idea, they take a Ubuntu server and they harden it to no end, and then they put this really cool secure proxy on it, but they want to share it with the world. They post it on VM Depot. Then you go there, you take that image, you deploy it to Azure. Now, the way they make money is once you deploy it, you may get a pop-up that says, if you really like that software and you need support, here's my phone number. But the software itself, it's open source license, it's free. VM Depot, there are hundreds of different solutions, so they're just right out of that. Powered by Vietnamese, a pre-configured, ready-to-run image for running a VanTUG cart on Microsoft Azure. So I'm assuming it's some kind of e-commerce platform on an open source. Perfect. It runs on a VanTUG cart, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. Fully supported on Azure. We go back to what I said earlier. I got two questions back there. When we said that we sell three things in Azure: compute, network, storage. As a business who's looking at making profit and being completely transparent here, do you think we care whether or not you're running a Windows workload or a Linux workload in an Azure environment? We're still charging you for compute, network, and storage. If you want to run a complete Windows environment, my stock portfolio thanks you. But we're still, it's not the point. We wholeheartedly embrace open source. One more example, and then I'm going to go to those two questions. Websites. If I go to a new website from a gallery, we have all kinds of different open source frameworks. We have Tomcat, Drupal, Node.js. The amount of stuff, yes, the underlying machine that's running this is an IIS box running on 2012 R2. If you absolutely want to run it on a Linux machine, then you don't deploy a Azure website, you deploy a virtual machine with Linux and you install whatever you need on it. But it's supported, but it's there. So yes, we'll pull that one and then.
But just some clarification about the support of Ubuntu and CentOS distribution. That is the support as infrastructure, right? So you're providing an infrastructure and we give you the VM, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a platform. You're not supporting a platform. Like you're not supporting.
No, if you have a problem with Ubuntu, you can't call the Microsoft 100 number and say, I'm
so
a
you're not
problem.
supporting that, right? So we're supporting an infrastructure which is virtualized.
Meaning it's been fully tested and it works.
Okay, all right.
Okay, if you go in and start recompiling the kernel and it stops working, well, if you call the 800 number, you may not get much help.
Okay, I understand. So what about the Docker you're talking about? Are you supporting the Docker as the Docker itself, or are you supporting running Docker within the
We support the infrastructure, the Docker infrastructure, so that you can take that Docker container and drop it on Azure.
Okay, so it's Docker running within Windows then, right? Is that
There's a Docker client in Windows, but Docker, the infrastructure for Docker at this point is still on Ubuntu.
So you said, oh, okay.
So it's a Ubuntu backend running on Azure that supports Docker, but it's managed with Windows.
Okay. So like Microsoft running Ubuntu, like VMs.
In Azure, absolutely.
You guys running it?
Oh, I don't know.
No, I mean,
It's part of that special sauce that they don't show us.
because the question is that you support Docker, that means you have to run on the Linux platform.
Well, it's supported.
Oh,
Doesn't mean we're supporting it, it means it's supported on Azure.
Okay, this is a question that, will we talk about the platform as a service as well as, like, let's say I'm an IT.
So are you the guy that sent me the Office 365 questions?
No, I haven't.
That was you? I am not, I have to admit, platform as a service, I am not an Office 365 guy. I use it every day. I would not be able to live without it, but I have enough to keep track of the infrastructure and the platform as a service. I've not really had time, so those questions should have been, or I'll pass them on to Anthony, who is my front-end guy, who may be better at answering them. So those 2 questions you sent me, I've already passed them on. I'm just waiting for him to answer them back. Actually, you know when you, like crapshoot? I won the crapshoot this week. Because I'm in BC where it's like 10 degrees, and I sent him to Halifax.
That's cool.
You just tease them that you're in the Canadian tropics.
I got out of the plane and went, what do I need my apartment for? Fantastic. Anyway, any other questions? Yes,
I still have to finish.
Yes.
Yeah, one question I have. Let's say I'm an IT guy. I have to develop software, an in-house software that has a back, store all our customer data, everything onto a SQL backend.
Yes.
If we use infrastructure as a service, well, we're responsible for that. Let's say if we were to build our app using platform as a service.
Yes.
Will we have access to the data in a much more, let's say, what's the data availability of it? Do you have an SLA? Is it just like the data will be 100% available?
Most SLAs within Azure are either or 99.95 or 99.9.
That's what, 3 hours a year?
99.95 is about 3.5 hours a year of unplanned downtime. Now, the question that typically follows is, how come you're not doing 5 nines? Well, 5 nines is the equivalent of less than 4 minutes of downtime a year. And the cost difference between 99.95 and 99.999 is ridiculous. You'd have to spend millions and millions and millions of dollars just in redundancies.
And the end user has a shot DSL line trying to connect to it.
Exactly.
So it's not wake up.
Exactly.
What's the difference between your free provider and free mail provider and one that you pay?
Exactly.
Dollars, because they're just something.
However, and I have that questions today, some of our competitors are doing
No way.
4 nines. However, if you look at a year, Q4, Q1, Q2, and Q3. I have a really bad handwriting. Sure. But you know where I'm going. They measured their SLA every quarter. We measure our SLA every month. That means that if we mess up, I almost said a bad word here, if we mess up for 1 month, we owe you money. And they're all financially backed. It's not just, it's best effort, it's an SLA, but if we don't meet it, there's no teeth to it. They're actually financially backed SLAs. So at the end of the month, if we did not do well, we owe you money. I don't know what the mechanics are. I don't know if somebody sends you a check or if they give you a credit. I haven't looked into that. I'm not interested in that. All I know is that you get money back. In what format? I don't know. If they have 1 month that doesn't go well, now they have 2 months to make up for it. So yes, they say they offer 99.99, but they don't calculate it as often, so they have more wiggle room. So that's one of the difference with SLAs and the way we calculate it versus some of our competitors. So it's always an interesting conversation. In terms of data, once you're in Azure, whether or not you've done infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, you can have the website on the platform, your database in IaaS, or even across in your own data center. So if you're worried about compliance, that compliance says that your data can't leave the country, then put your database here.
Well, if all their servers are in US, that kind of doesn't work.
No. If you put your database here, and the front end, there's only static info in the front end. There's no compliance here. It's the same information that if somebody was going to go from the US and get to your website. There's no real difference. But the actual data never leaves your office. It's not stored in the US or stored in Europe or wherever. And eventually, don't quote me on that, eventually we will be everywhere. It's just going to take time. There's a science as to where we put data centers. The number one priority of the data center location committee is the next data center, wherever we put it, where are going to we gain the most incremental business? If that means putting it in Canada, then that's where the next one's going to be. If that means putting it in France, that's where it's going to be. Or if it's South Africa, then that's where it's going to be. It's whatever is going to drive the most incremental business with that investment. And it's really hard to put one data center in Canada. I go back to, anybody here is an AD person? Active Directory? Okay, think about this. What is the golden rule for the number of DCs that you should have in your environment? Not one. So take that and put that into cloud concepts. You put one domain, you put one data center in Canada. You as a consumer or as a client say, I want to put my data in Canada because it has to stay in Canada. Well, what happens if that data center crashes? Where does your data fail over to? Not Canada. You're no longer compliant. So we can't just put one, you have to put two. When that decision comes down, I'll put money on the table right now. That when that decision comes down, and I don't know if it's going to happen or if it's even being considered, but whenever it does, because I know it's going to happen at some point, they're not going to announce one, they're going to announce two.
But actually free, right? Because you see your data is always 3 copies.
No, 3 copies
It's not
within.
within the site. I see.
So if you've got a data center in the east and a data center in the west, you're going to have 3 different copies of your data across different fault domains within the same data center. So on different electrical grids, on different networking, on different hardware, your fabric controllers are going to be completely different so that not one can crash the other. And then that's if you're locally redundant. If you're geo-redundant, which means replicated across multiple sets, though in the other region, you're going to have 3 more. So you get a total of 6 copies of your data at any given time. That make sense?
Yeah.
All right. Are there any ongoing questions? Oh, go ahead.
Using there's Active Directories, a client that deals with several other organizations, and we're using the cloud or hybrid cloud. Just
Azure Active Directory is a different beast. Azure Active Directory and Windows Active Directory are 2 completely different things that have 2 completely different purposes. Windows Active Directory has your identification and authentication. Yes, that they share. Active Directory on Windows, so within your domain, does application container, does group policies, it does a whole bunch of different things that Azure Active Directory does not. Azure Active Directory is only there and only does identification and authentication. So when you connect to a Azure environment, so even if it's Office 365 with Federation, it identifies you, then based on that identity, figures out where should that person be authenticated to. If it's through ADFS, then it says, okay, to my ADFS server, where is that person supposed to be authenticated from? I know who he is, I want to prove it now. Oh, it's that server over there. So that authentication request gets sent to the owner, it gets validated, and it comes back, he's good, that's ADFS. AD sync, where the user identity and the user authentication method, so password hash, are being synced into Microsoft Azure AD. It identifies that person, says, oh, I own those credentials. I own the authentication of that person, so yes, you're in. And that's only what Azure Active Directory does. So when you have to be careful when you talk to a customer, or when a customer talks to you and they say they want to do Active Directory, but they want to do it in a hybrid cloud, or there's completely different things. So you have to be very careful as to what you tell them that can and cannot be done with Azure Active Directory. In a hybrid situation, so if we go back to here, there's nothing that stops me from taking one of the domain control, having a domain controller on premises, and dropping a domain controller in my cloud environment. That will allow my machines, my virtual machines in my environment, to become a member of the domain, and in turn will allow you to manage those machines based on group policies, on service accounts, and all the good stuff that Windows Active Directory does. But it does not allow for somebody accessing a cloud service to be authenticated by Active Directory, by Azure Active Directory. On top of that, you're going to sync the identities on that PC with Azure Active Directory, which is a platform as a service. So there's really three big platform services: Azure Websites, Azure SQL, and Azure AD. So you have to sync the two in order to be able to use that. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm confused, is it Azure AD allow resources on the cloud?
Azure AD will allow you to authenticate and identify and authenticate users coming into a cloud environment. So if I connect, so let me go back here, and I'm going to close that browser so I lose my session completely. And go back here, and I try to connect to Azure. So of course it's going to use Azure because we're synced with Azure. Actually, Microsoft is not synced with Azure, we are federated with Azure. So if I go here, try to go to my portal, okay, I pick Windows, and it says redirecting, talking to your organization sign-in page. So it's redirecting me for my authentication. Now my corporate page, so now you notice the page has changed. It's not the Azure page anymore. It's the Microsoft page that comes up and says, yeah, you can sign up with Azure. This allows me to do multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication is really cool in Azure. We all have one of these, right? Some of us, and I had one in my class today, actually still have a flip phone. Azure Active Directory I can do with a smart card and pick a certificate and authenticate that way, or say username and password, put in my password, do sign in, then it'll stop and say, for security reasons, we require additional information. Now, if we wait for the signal, I hope the signal is good in this room. Good. Not shielded? No. Okay. Because I've seen data centers where, oh, see, I'm getting, you have received a multi-factor authentication notification. So I go and I log into my phone. And I have my app here that's asking me to authenticate. So I go here and I check for, and I put in my passcode. And of course, I'm running beta software even on my phone, so it's not always as responsive as regular. So I put in my password, I hit the authenticate. And now I'm in.
Just don't forget that phone.
Okay?
Just don't forget your phone.
Don't forget your phone.
So you didn't even need to refresh the page.
I didn't have to refresh the page. It waited for the back end to say, he's good. Now, if I didn't have, if I had a flip phone instead of a phone with an app, authenticator app on it.
Text.
When I registered my phone as my second device, as my authentication device, I would have been able to tell Azure in my registration that I'm using not a smartphone and not an app, but I'm using a phone. At this case, at this point, when I connected to it, my phone would have rang and a voice at the other end would have said, we have detected your login. If this is you, please enter your PIN and pound, followed by pound. So you put in your PIN and pound. If this was not you, press 0 and pound. 0 and pound. Because if I got that far, that means I have your password. You've already been compromised. The second factor authentication is just making sure you don't go through. Now if I press 0 and pound, my account gets locked, my password gets regenerated to something random, and my administrator gets an email saying that I have been compromised. That's two-factor authentication, but I did not have to spend thousands of dollars to equip everybody in my workforce with an RSA token, for example. You know those little tokens that change their code every 30 seconds? Didn't have to do that. We all have a phone in our pockets or on our desks. So this is what Azure, and that's Azure that's doing that. To multi-factor authentication, it's built into Azure. Did that answer your question? Any other question? Yes.
Just out of curiosity, with so much compute power, does Microsoft get their computers? Do they buy them or do they?
Well, we have them built for us.
Okay.
And it's Dell and HP that build them.
Okay.
And our build specs are published. So if you wanted to use the same structure with the same hardware, you can.
Also, it's not like Facebook or Google.
No. Except that we may not give you the special sauce in our Azure fabric.
As you're getting when you're not in the Azure.
However, that being said, since TechEd Europe, they've announced the CPS, the Cloud Platform System. It's Azure in a box. It's an appliance. The appliance is about 20 square feet and about 7 feet tall, but it's still an appliance. And you get that into your data center. There's a whole process you have. It's worse than getting a Ferrari. You don't walk into a dealership and say, "I'll take that one." You actually have to kind of check your credit and do everything. Not only can you buy it, but can you maintain it? All those checks still apply.
Are you going to feed it?
Are you going to feed it? Exactly. It's like I'm trying to find a puppy right now. She actually asked me stuff like that. Are you going to feed it? Really?
I'm gonna make my own Azure and call it Bruce.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Actually, that's a good point. Some of our unnamed competitors, and I'm not talking about the big ones that everybody's thinking about, some of our competitors have said, we are worldwide. We are in X amount of countries. What they don't tell you is that some of these competitors in some of those countries, all they have is a rack in a co-location space. They don't own the data center, they don't have a data center, they have a hosted rack somewhere in that country, just enough to say they're in that geography. So check them. All our data centers, except the ones in China, are ours. And I believe, I've never been able to get an official answer as to why that is. I'm being told from some of my Chinese friends that it's because in China you can't own the land. So we can't own the building, like we were basically renting like a long-term lease. So that's why they call it partner operated. We still operate what's in it, the machines that are in it are still us, but we don't actually own the data center.
Yeah, maybe it's different if we were there and instead of owning an apartment, you rent it for 40 years or something.
Something like that. So it's a little different, but that's the only place where that nuance comes into play. Everywhere else, we own everything from the moat in. We don't have a moat, but you might as well do. I went to visit the Quincy Data Center in Washington State. Have you been there?
No.
If you can organize a trip to the MTC and they say, well, go visit the Quincy Data Centers, it's worth it. You don't get to see a lot because they were not going to let you onto the floor. But the floor, the data center floor is 10 football fields of racks of servers. And you know how much that room costs. Now put that 10 football fields.
There's a guy in San Diego, there's a company called Beijing Wire. and it's 440,000 square feet. And he has 66 megawatts of power, so a sawmill is a megawatt. That's how big they are.
Okay, another scaling statistic that actually kind of took me by surprise.
The solutions network
No,
for everything.
admins. What is your ratio admin to servers?
1,000 per week.
1 to 1,000? It's actually pretty good. What is yours? Have any clue? 1 to 20, 1 to 50?
What type of servers? Like physical servers or?
Doesn't matter. Servers. Both
Well,
together.
across our customer base, we're effectively 10 servers to 1 admin.
10 servers to 1 admin. Our ratio is 1 admin to 10,000 servers. That's how we scale. That's how, because everything is automated. At any point, an admin has 0 rights anywhere in a data center. 0. So you can't compromise an administrator.
Oh, no inside jobs.
You can't have an inside job to say, while you're in there, grab the data from my buddy here. Well, first of all, once he gets onto the floor, the disk that says buddy's data, it's not labeled. So you gotta find it, and it's 10 football fields of rack. So get there early. But when he gets there, he has no rights anywhere. An issue must come up that gets raised by the system and say, hey, something has to be done. And it can't be done logically, it can't be automated, so it has to be assigned to an admin. Then a manager assigns it to a team identifies a person. That person gets just the amount of rights that they need to do that particular job. And if we think that that job will take 4 hours, in 4 hours your credentials will expire. So you go in, you do the job, you log out, you're done. No more rights. So you can't compromise one person, you'd have to compromise the whole data center staff. You walk into the gate, surrounding, I said that there's a moat, but there's not a moat, but sometimes you would think that there should be. You get to the gate, and in some data centers, there are guards with an MP5 on their chest. I understand it's the States, but still, I'm not used to being greeted at the door by a man carrying a weapon. Who are you? Oh, I'm with the tour. Sorry. We had a partner tour, so some of our partners that went to the MTC and then went to visit the data centers, there was a bus going. One guy missed the bus, so he thought, I'm just going to get in my car and follow it. Well, the bus went through. He didn't. So he went back into town. Because he said, well, I'm with these guys. Here are my credentials. Here's my card. Here's the invitation. No, you're not in the bus. Get lost. You don't make it into the perimeter unless you actually have a reason to be there. And there's very few people. 1 to 10,000 does not have a huge workforce in a data center. Anyway, so I did have some questions that were emailed to me. See, I didn't forget about you. Do you anticipate that Microsoft might develop a cloud-based backup solution for premises server and data? Already done. I will show it to you because I am using it on this machine. It's the same client, it's the same format. You go to Azure, you create in recovery services a backup vault. That backup vault has number of storage, so how much storage am I storing right now? 206 gigs. And I've got one server registered in that vault. It's this machine. Because even though my stuff is on Office 365, like OneDrive for business, and my personal stuff is in my OneDrive, I have VHDs in here, I have stuff that's just too big to constantly sync, so I'm keeping them local. But every night I get to buy a hotel, I plug it into the wire, I log on, I don't even log on, I just turn it on, lock the screen, and go to bed.
Just pulls an incremental backup.
And it does an incremental backup. If I look at my backup client,
Does the backup client have very much overhead? It's just,
say that again?
does the backup client have much overhead? It's very.
No. It's an MMC console. So right now, you see last night, it's because I'm running I'm not running a public build of Windows 10. So every once in a while, it just kind of goes. So I did that last night, so it didn't have the backup, so I restarted it this morning. So, but it did complete. And I can schedule a job.
And it will back up the whole thing.
Is this,
Backing up the job, you actually select the item. And the item could be the C drive, the D drive, could be a volume or a directory on the C drive. It just basically does everything. So let's say,
If you get too smart, you're gonna miss stuff.
yeah, I could say back up the whole machine, but then it's a lot of data. Then it'll ask you, it's okay, do you want to modify this? So the folders, add, remove, exclude. That's the same as every other backup solution. Do I want to do a backup for every day or every week? So I've got every day at 12:30 a.m. And I have a daily retention policy for 180 days. That means that I can go back 180 days and get a snapshot of what my machine looked like that day. If you were going to restore today's what, Tuesday? Tuesday. So let's say the worst case scenario is a Friday morning. You have a failure on Friday morning. So you're running a grandfather, father, son backup tape rotation. So you need to restore as of Friday morning, just before your next grandfather. So you have to go back a month, get your grandfather, then restore every father in between, and then every son from the last father to the date that you are today. So there's a potential for 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 restores. So that's 8 sets of tapes that may or may not be on premises.
they're not.
They're not. So that means you're paying Iron Mountain or the bank or somewhere, or you do the Monday morning trek to the bank to put them in the safety deposit box. You're still paying for that. How much is a DLT tape now?
Oh, stupidly. They paid, what, £80 or something for the last one?
$80?
80 pounds for half at least. We're dealing in pounds, I'm dealing
Oh, in pounds. Okay, yeah. So they're fairly expensive. The tape libraries themselves are very expensive, because especially when you grow out of one. Because not only is it now you're screwed with that, but now you get the Monday morning, I got to change the tape thing, and now I've missed my backup window, so I'm going to miss a few files because they're open or locked or whatever. If you take all those in consideration. So I have right under that 180 days without having to do grandfather, father, son rotation. I just pick December 4th. Restore my machine as of December 4th. Done. When I say next, it asks me to confirm, and then I hit the fini button. I'm going to close that because I don't want to run it. And now my machine at 12:30 is going to make that, is going to run that backup. That client is the same for Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, Windows 2008, 2008 R2, 2012, and 2012 R2. And if you go,
we're effectively just paying your costs, there's no cost for the service itself, we're just paying.
that's where you get the client. Once you create your vault. Oh, by the way, it's encrypted. It encrypts before it leaves your machine. So it's stored at rest, encrypted. You own the key. You put in the passphrase. So even if we get sued and have to provide that data, it's still encrypted. They still have to go see you to get the key.
It's available across all regions?
It's available across all regions, and the price just changed.
Okay.
And I believe it's something like $50 for 500 gigs worth per month, plus a surcharge for the amount of storage. So it comes out like if you got 10 gigs, it basically will almost nothing. So I'm not the most accurate cost estimator, and the change just happened, so I haven't had a chance to sit down and work through all because there's still egress. No, there's no cost, network cost, because you're putting stuff into Azure. There may be a cost, I have not confirmed that, when you do a restore.
See, we're having to build a platform on testing Secret and Aperture for DR solutions and cloud backup solutions for legal and financial institutions in the UK. A couple of financial and legal institutions. And we have difficulty with Azure because there's limitations on where the data can be held and has to be held within the United Kingdom for those companies. And there's no Azure within the United Kingdom. So
At the moment.
yeah, at the moment.
Because there may or may not be a list that may or may not contain countries that may or may not be on it to be considered or not for where the next data center is going to be.
So we're kind of having to hedge our bets to develop something or wait till that is available.
But it's available.
Yeah.
But only where we have data centers. Okay. Disaster recovery. You just mentioned something else that I want to touch on. So you have your own network. This is your DR site. You have Azure in the middle. There's such a thing called the Azure Site Recovery. It's a service in Azure. What it does is it connects to SCVMM running in your environment and replicates your VHDs while they're running in real time to either Azure itself, so Azure can become your disaster recovery site, or we'll replicate them to site B. Okay. And then from site B to site C, and however complicated you want to make your recovery infrastructure is. The latency between syncs is less than 15 seconds. So, okay, the original sync is going to take a long time, but once the original sync is done, or you've seeded your original data, it's just the deltas that go across. It's block level, very quick, while your machine is running. This is a cold standby. So if this disappears, it blows up, goes up in flames, whatever, you have to turn it on. If you automate it with Orchestrator or something like that, that works. Or if you go manually to the portal and say, turn on, turn on, turn on, turn on, turn on, that also works. But you're paying for this site, or you can put that into a virtual site in Azure as well. Which means you could basically simulate the failover anytime. Because we all test our failover procedures, right? The same as we test all of our backups at least once a month, right? Backup, or we do a test restore on the segregated machine, right? Yeah, the last person who told me that, they had an event, which is another thing that Azure is really, really good for, testing. Create a cloud service, it's segregated. Put a clone of your DC in there, and then test your procedures. A friend of mine who works for a municipality that is not Ottawa, but will remain nameless, thought he was connected because they have their QA and their dev environment on different VLANs, so that they're segregated, but it's on the same wire. So he thought he was connected to the production environment and wrote a script to go clean up some of the OUs that had been there for years, misjudged his for loops or his do while or one of the loops inside, and just ran it to test, and it started at the top and started deleting OUs, going down, including, and that was the kicker, the application container and Active Directory. Then realized it was connected to production environment. Now, let's pull out that grandfather, father, son tape rotation out of the closet.
After you change your underwear.
After you change your underwear. Or somebody else pulls it out of the closet because you've been fired. Then they realized that the only backup that they had that was valid was 8 weeks old. So they lost 8 weeks worth of transaction in their AD. That affected SQL, that affected Exchange, that affected SharePoint, because all of those systems use the application container to sync their configurations. So all of that could have been avoided in a cloud service, because a cloud service, unless you specifically create a site-to-site VPN or some kind of VPN to get into it or out of it is self-contained and is segregated from any other cloud service. So Azure is your friend. How many people here have MSDN subscriptions? How many of you that have your hands down? I know people in your office that have MSDN subscriptions. Because what I say to people that say, I don't have one, but our developers do, are they using their Azure benefits? I don't know. Check. Because what you can do, you go to, you get them to activate their benefit, then go to their settings, into administrator, and add you as an administrator of their Azure benefits. So if they're not going to use them, why don't you use them? The licensing, the MSDN subscription is not transferable, but you can share the admin of those resources. That's one way I tell people, because IT pros, we used to get TechNet, now that's gone. MSDN is more expensive, so sometimes it's a hard sell, but the devs have always had their MSDN subscription for development purposes. So go talk to your devs. If they're not using them, you use them. I get $160 worth of Azure credits every month, so it renews every month, through my Azure subscription, through my MSDN subscription. That's a lot of testing in Azure. Of course, if you're running a couple of G5 machines and you forget to turn them off, it may not last that long. And yes, I have done that. Yeah, create a G5 machine, yeah, create another one. All right, let's go for beers. Okay. Showed up the next day, and of course, I had to give a camp. I had 30 people that showed up looking for me to show them the benefits of Azure. And I couldn't get into my subscription because it was expired. Well, not expired, but I had run out of credits. So I did what everybody else does. I created a dummy Outlook.com account, went in, signed up for the pre-pass, put in my credit card number, and I had 30 days or $100 worth of credit. It worked, but not something I would recommend. So that's good. So that was the question. Is there ways to develop backup solution? Already there. Backing up machines, backing up clients, and backing up sites. Already in place. Next question. I like it when they're ahead of time, I can prepare. In your opinion, with the internet access and speed increasing, is it likely that we'll see less client-side processing power on the desktop, tablet, mobile, and more hosted services? No. I think we're going to see a lot more of the, on the mobile side, it's kind of, we're going to see more rich applications, definitely, because my cell phone has got a much more stronger processor than it had like even 2 years ago. A quad-core Snapdragon with 38 gigs of, man, the other one just made calls. Yeah, with PowerShell web access running in Azure and a browser on my phone, I can actually manage my entire environment with a PowerShell session on my phone. The typing is a little awkward, but it works. I could be on a golf course and reboot a server. My boss won't know. Will we access results in the application on the web through our RDP interface? No, I don't think so. It is available now. It's called Remote App in Azure, where you can publish application. But it's not enough that I'm going to see, that we'll see less client-side processing. It just opens up other devices that are already there. We're just going to leverage them to do other things. Any other questions? What time is it?
We're getting close.
8:30.
8:30.
One question to clarify more what Bruce was asking earlier. Although Azure AD isn't a on-premise Windows Active Directory, could you effectively put a VM up that does your BDC or yours?
Put a DC in Azure?
Yes, as a VM.
Absolutely. One thing that will kind of throw, not a wrench, but kind of slow you down a bit. Networking wise, what is the one requirement or the one best practice, networking wise, for putting a DC anywhere?
Redundancy.
No, networking wise, I mean static IP address. They'll always complain if it doesn't have a static IP address. In Azure, there is no such thing as a static IP address. Not just in Azure, in public cloud, period. Get your cloud service. Everything inside the cloud service on your virtual network, the address that it gets is called the DIP, or the dynamic IP address. Everything, the one address that's assigned to the cloud service itself is called the VIP, or the virtual IP address. So that could be an actual 104.75.29.39.33.9. That's just pick an address, but it's an internet routable. It's out there. It's accessible. If you've got a machine internally, so let's say you want to connect to that machine from the outside, you have to create an endpoint. That means identifying a port outside. So let's say 53389, and inside 3389. So that port translation is called an endpoint. There is no such thing as a static IP address. So that being said, so we now know what the IP address on outside is. That changes. So if you shut down your cloud service, you bring it back up, that may change. Your virtual machine inside, if you reboot it, it's the HCP. It may change. It's going to try to always keep the same one, but it's not guaranteed. So what do you do when you want to put that DC in here? That was a problem. Product group got involved. We said, hey, that doesn't work. It needs to be able to do it. So the solution they came up with is to assign an IP address to that box. An assignment in Azure terms is the same as a DHCP reservation in on-premises terms. So you do a registration or a reservation in Azure, and the length of that reservation is the mathematical equivalent to the hexadecimal space that's in the registry, which equals, I think it's 136 years, 8 months, 6 days, and then a few hours. I've made the calculation one, but I can't remember exactly. Chances are 136 years is going to outlive your server. So once you've got that reservation, then you assign that IP address to that VM. Once that's done, then you install your directory services on that VM, and then you can promote it.
So it's dynamic, it just never changes.
Exactly. That's our way around it. It will still complain. Hey, this is not a static IP address. You get the big or yellow triangle. Ignore it, but ignore it with confidence. That it will work. And I know it does because look at my VMs. I have a DC sitting right here, to which I have assigned address 192.168.11.100. It'll always get that IP address. That cannot be done in the portal. It has to be done in PowerShell, and it is documented on connectpro.net. And I know because I wrote it myself.
Excellent.
Does that answer your question? More than the previous answer.
That's helping.
Okay?
It's helping. Yeah.
That's helping? Yes. IPv6 in Azure, everything you see, everything you can control is IPv4. Why? Because it's all non-routable IP addresses, so we're never going to run out.
Well, like your home Like your home network.
It's 192.168 dot something dot something, or it's 10.0.0.0 slash something, or it's 172 dot something dot something. They're all non-routable IP addresses internally. Now, at the physical layer, yes, we have IPv6, it's just not exposed into the tenant part. Is that going to stay that forever? No idea. Okay. It might change. We don't really know what. There is a website for, and actually I wrote about it last week. There is a website that shows you the roadmap, the Azure roadmap. Let me see if I can find it. Microsoft Cloud Platform Roadmap. Let's see if I can find that URL. Where we will show you what is been recently made available, what is in public preview, which is the new word for beta, what's in development, and what we've canceled for cloud infrastructure, enterprise mobility, data management and analytics, application development, and Internet of Things. So at any point you can go, if you're a DBA, for example, and you want to know what's in public preview for data management, and it'll show you that there are new experiences for Power BI, that there's new stuff for machine learning coming up, that there's new Azure Stream Analytics, and you can follow the links and learn more. So everything, that's new. This is, do any of you ever get the, it's called IT Tech internally, it's the Microsoft Global Relationship Survey. It's a survey that, like if you registered for a TechNet newsletter, if you have any kind of relationship with Microsoft, there's like 100,000 people out of everybody in each geography that gets picked and gets a survey. How do you feel about our transparency? Do we tell you enough? So it's all about consumer, IT pros, dev. There's different surveys for different, what you've identified yourself as. Are you an IT pro? Are you a dev? Are you a consumer? Do you have confidence that we're going in the right direction? There's all kinds of questions. It's a fairly involved questionnaire, but it gives us a good feedback as to, are people satisfied with what we're doing? If not, why? What are they not happy with? And so we know that people have never been happy with Windows 8. We can see the last 2 years worth of surveys that tell us very clearly that the start menu needs to be back. Windows 10's coming, and I'm happy to say the start menu is back. One of those things, one of those survey nuggets is people wanted us to be more transparent as to what we're working on, because people need to plan in advance. So am I going to plan something like you're saying? Am I going to plan an on-premises backup solution? Or is there something coming up that can help me? And that's why those websites, or one of these websites, if there's one for enterprise mobility, there's one for cloud platform, you can go and actually see what we're working on, what we've just released, what's in beta, and what we've decided to cancel. It's a direct result of customer and individual feedback. So we do listen. People think we don't, but we do. Sometimes we've listened, we heard you, but now we have to turn the Titanic. It doesn't turn on a dime. We have to, everybody starts paddling the other way. So it takes time, but it's going to get there. Any other questions?
That's probably a good wrap spot then.
Good.
Because it is getting late.
8:45.
You were talking about the appliance?
Yes.
Azure appliance. On April 9th, we're going to be doing a meeting with .NET BC on how to set up Azure for your local premise.
Is it, it's Azure, it's a Windows Azure pack.
Yes.
Which is not quite Azure, but it's an Azure-like experience. It's missing that secret sauce. this sprinkle, that pixie dust that we sprinkle in
Pierre,
the pots.
that's Pierre,
That's what we want.
that's Pierre,
Pixie
that's
dust,
the
Pierre?
special stuff.
Yeah, you just gotta apply some to the right Microsoft rep and it works.
No, I'm not telling you when the data center's coming. So on that note then, thank you very much for coming. I hope this was informative. And we'll see you next time I'm in Vancouver.